What are styled components? And what on earth is this CSS and JS thing that people keep talking about? That is the topic of today's video. So styled components, and CSS and JS more generally, is just a way of attaching CSS directly to your components. When you have your CSS in a style sheet file, it's separate from your components, and you have to reach into that CSS and grab styles out using class names. And that can be quite tricky, and there's not a lot of dynamic things you can do there, and it's not really the way we think about components. We have this component mental model that has components as one nice, neat little package where we have the structure of our HTML, our logic, and our style all encapsulated within this primitive that we call a component. But when you use a style sheet and hook in with class names, we're breaking that mental model and putting our styles separate. And that doesn't allow for the sort of behaviors that we would expect. But styled components and CSS and JS allow us to put that style, that CSS, directly into our components and then manipulate it directly with JavaScript. So in front of you, you can see the styled components website, which has this nice little editor where you can just tinker around with style components. So you can read the documentation and dig into what's actually going on here and play around with it to see what style components is all about. But for this video, we're going to build a little app. So it is pre-built using traditional CSS in a style sheet file. And all it does is we have this button we can click and it will change the theme from light to dark. But it's paid the cat tax, so I'm off the hook there. And we're doing it using CSS classes and manipulating those class names in our components. And we're going to convert that whole thing to use styled components, and hopefully that will illustrate just how powerful the idea of styled components is. So let's jump into the code and see what we can do. So we are using React, we're using some hooks, which is, I'm going to do a video on that. That is a new, very exciting thing in React, and I'm going to do a whole big thing about it. And then we're just importing a bunch of other components. We're creating this state variable called theme, and we're starting it at a value of light. And then we have this toggle theme function that just toggles the theme from light to dark and then sets it as the state variable. And then the exciting part is our components. So we have this container and a card and then a card image. So that's the cat that we're just passing it here. And then this card footer that has a button. The click on the button triggers that toggle theme function. And then we're passing the value of the current theme into the card and into the button. And the button text is also that theme. So we can take a look at these other components we have. So the button itself is just a regular HTML button that has a class name of btn, and we're passing in the theme as another class name, and then just giving it props so that the click handler propagates. And we'll go into our card. And here our card is again just the class name of card and the theme. And then the card image is just a normal image where it passes in the image source. And the footer is just a div with the card footer. And all of these classes for the CSS live in the app.css. So we have the container, we're defining a width and all of this, and our card. So all of our classes and our styles are here in the CSS. And this is where the idea of CSS and JS kind of tries to take over. So right now, the way that our app is structured with our components and our CSS is very much in the traditional style where we have a specific CSS file that is separate and all of our classes go in here. And then inside our components, we have to reference those class names. And right now we have the theme here. So the theme, if you remember, can be light or it can be dark. And if we check out our CSS, we can see we have the base card rules here. And then we have card.light sets the background to a light color, and card.dark sets the background to a dark color. And then we have the same down here for button, where we have the default button styles, and then a button light class and a button dark class that affects it in the ways that you would expect based on the theme. And this works. So we did show the demo, and we can click this button and it will toggle between the different themes. It works fine. But the problem is the mental model. This isn't how we think about our code in the React world where we have components. We're thinking about the whole component, the structure of the HTML, the functionality, and the styling as one unit. But we've separated them into a CSS file, but we keep the functionality and the structure together in the component. So some clever people decided one day, why can't we just put them all together into one consolidated unit and use that instead of having a CSS file? And therein was born the movement of css-in-js, which is exactly as the name implies. You're putting your CSS into the JavaScript instead of keeping it in a separate file. And one of the prominent players in the CSS and JS space right now is a library called styled components. And that in and of itself is pretty cool. Having all of the units of our component together, the structure, the style, and the logic. That's pretty good. But styled components adds another layer of amazingness on top, which is our styles can be generated dynamically. Our styles can be manipulated with JavaScript. We can literally have JavaScript functions creating some of our CSS. And that allows for super dynamic, amazing behavior while still keeping everything nice and neat. So let's try and convert this application with our separated CSS into an application that uses styled components. So the first step is we'll close out and we will yarn add styled-components. And that will do its thing. And now we'll open back into Vim and come into our button component. So we'll start off by converting this into a styled component. So we will import styled from styled components. And we'll use that to create a new button component. So the button component we already have is something that uses a button HTML element, and then we're giving it the class names and the props and then the children so that the children go inside the button. This is kind of all boilerplate. And style components allows us to abstract all of that away. We don't need to worry about that boilerplate. So we can say button equals styled.button. So this is saying that we want an HTML button element, but wrapped as a styled component. And then we do something a bit weird, which is we give it the backticks. And then into here, we can put CSS. And this definitely tripped me up when I saw this because this syntax is strange. What we're doing here is calling a function, but we would expect we would go styled.button and then do that and give it a string in there. But doing this with the backticks is exactly the same as doing this, but it allows us to have multi-line strings. So we'll remove that, and all we need to do into here is give the CSS for our button. So we'll come up into our CSS, and we'll remove all of that from the button, and we'll just paste it directly into our style components. And this is a thing, like if you've used React, you might know of the style prop that you can pass an object, and then into that object you give name value pairs of CSS rules. But it's not real CSS, it's kind of pseudo CSS, where you have to camel case instead of using dashes, like text transform here would be text transform camel case without the dash. So it's this weird version of CSS. But style components is like actual CSS. As you saw, we can just copy and paste it directly from our CSS file into our style components. So now we can save that. We'll remove this button class. And then we have these two rule sets for light and dark. So how do we do that with style components? Because we don't have classes or anything on this. So what we can do is define a color and background color and then give the style components a function that will decide what the value will be based on a prop that gets passed into the style component. And that's pretty incredible, really. But I think it's difficult to wrap your mind around it with just words, so let's just do it. So I'll just take this and I'll close out the styles for now, and I'll just paste the color, opacity, and background color down here for now. So in all of our other rules, we're defining the name of the rule and then the rule. But because this is inside backticks, we can actually put JavaScript code in this using this syntax. So instead of giving it the rule directly, we can actually remove that and put one of these in there, and then we can put JavaScript code inside the curly braces. So we'll give it an arrow function that takes props. And this is style components is doing this. It knows when it sees these functions inside the CSS rules, it will call that function and pass in the props that we passed into the styled component when we use it in our render method. So we can check props.theme is equal to light. And if it is, we'll give it some color. And if it isn't, we'll give it a different color. And then we go back to our CSS to remind ourselves of what those colors were. So if it's light, we give it white color. And if it's dark, we give it FE. So that's the color here for dark. And we use this color here for white. Then we can do the same for opacity. So we'll give it a function that takes props again. We'll again check props.theme is equal to light. If it is, we'll give it an opacity of 1. And if it isn't, we'll give it an opacity of 0.7. So this is here our opacity for 0.7 when it's dark. And if it's light, we want the opacity to be full 100%. So we've covered the opacity case. Save that. And now we just want to do the background color. So again, same procedure. Give it a function that takes props. We'll check props.theme equals light. And if it does, we'll give it FF4081. And if it's not light, we'll give it 676767. And now we can remove those CSS rules. We'll close out our CSS so we can have a better look at what's going on here. So we have just normal CSS rules for our button. And then for the ones where we want dynamic behavior, we can give it a function and check props. And we're not limited to doing this inline function where it has to be this ternary operator. We could, hypothetically, have another CSS rule here and do this and call another function. And then down here, we can define call another function. And obviously this will take props. And then we can do arbitrary calculations inside of here, as long as at the end we return something that is a valid value for whatever this rule is. So this can be like a 100-line function that has super complicated calculations going on based on props. And then whatever that returns will be given that rule. So that's like super, super powerful. We can do so much with that. So we'll just remove that for now because we don't need that. We just want these arrow functions that are just checking if the theme is light or dark. And now we don't actually need this component down here because we've defined this HTML button with our styled components using style.button. And then the class names we don't need because we're giving it a style directly. And then we don't have to pass props because style components will propagate the props down for us, and style components will also handle the children for us. So I'll remove that, and we now have our first styled component. So right now this won't work because we're not exporting it, but we'll just check in the browser to see what we have. And it's attempts to import button, but it's not exported. So we'll come back up here. We'll export that out. And because we called it button, just like our previous component, when we import it into our app.js, it should work. And there we go. We can click and it's working exactly like it was before. We're just using a styled component for that button now. So let's continue our conversion from traditional CSS into styled components. We'll go into our card, import styled from styled components, and we'll create a card that is styled.div. And then into there, we will get hold of our card CSS. And we want the light and the dark as well. So that is the background. So as we did before, we'll give this a function that takes props. We will check props.theme equals light. And if it does, we will give it the color of FE. And if it doesn't, we'll give it the color of 4.5. So now we can remove that CSS, So now we've only got the container and the card footer CSS left. So we'll just save that and we'll remove this component. We'll export that. So now go back into the browser and everything is still working. That's a very good sign. And our card image is not actually doing anything. We've given it a class name here, but we're not actually doing anything with that in the CSS. So we don't need to touch that. Now we can just create the card footer styled component. So export const card footer equals styled.div. And into that, we will give it the card footer CSS, which is very simple. And we can remove all of that and remove that. So now the only thing left to do is to create the styled component for our container. So as always, import styled from styled components. Export const container equals style.div. And we'll grab hold of that CSS. Remove that. So now all of our CSS is gone. So we can delete that file for our app CSS. And we no longer have to import that in at the top of our app.js. So we can remove that completely. And we can remove this final component. And we don't need React anymore. So now we can come back into the browser and we can see it is still working. But we've converted it completely away from having a whole CSS file to using styled components. So that's basically style components in a nutshell. But now the possibilities are endless because our component JavaScript is aware of our styles and vice versa. They're now linked instead of being completely separate. So we can manipulate the styles using JavaScript. So let's just do something fun. We'll just open up our button again, and you'll notice that we don't have a font size here. So it's just the default size of the button. But let's create another value here that's font size. And again, we'll give it the function here. And we'll check if props.large text. And if that's true, we'll set the text to say 2M. I don't know, that's probably way too big, but it's just illustrating the point. And if it's not large text, we will set it to 1M. So now if we come back into our app.js, where we're actually using the button, we can just put large text as a prop onto that button. And if we come back into the browser, we'll see the text is large. And if we remove that large text and save again, the text size has gone back down to what it was. So we can add in this kind of complex functionality into our components where we can compose together different things based on props. So we can present a button component that is more than just a button HTML tag. It has understanding of different sizes and styles of buttons, different color themes that you can just bake into the CSS because you can use JavaScript functions. And then other people can use your component and just give it props to define how it looks. Like, I want this to be large. I want it to have some like small amounts of padding. I want it to be like dark theme, and I want it to have a box shadow. And you can add all of that as props, and it just works. There's no need to touch the CSS because whoever created the component has built this contract that allows that component a huge amount of dynamic styling based on props. And that is not possible in any easy way using the traditional CSS model. But now with css-in-js, the styling is more in line with our own mental model of how component systems work, and we can start to manipulate it in more dynamic and interesting ways. So hopefully this video has cleared up a little bit about what styled components are, why they're useful, and why CSS and JS as a movement is so exciting for the future of the web. So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, bell notification, all of that good stuff. But until next time, stay hungry and keep coding.